Alright, welcome back everyone. So again, just to recap, so far we've talked about the sort of three stages of working with other files: open, process, close. We've talked about sort of the two different processes you might be doing, reading and writing. We've seen writing is pretty straightforward. You use .write. Now I'll admit reading is slightly more complicated just because you have to process a lot of data from the file. And we've seen now how we can use a for loop to go through one line at a time in a file. Now I want to spend some time talking about processing strings. The reason I want to talk about that is because whenever you read stuff from files, all that data, it's all going to be strings. So it's really important to sort of practice processing these strings, because that's how you're going to be able to process the data and make it useful so that you can use it in your program itself. So a large part of working with files is processing and manipulating strings that is either read from the file or processing and manipulating data to sort of set it up to be formatted as a string correctly to write it to the file. So there are two extremely common string operations we will use with strings that are used in conjunction when you do file processing. These two string operations are string.strip and .split. So let's talk about these two in depth. First one we'll talk about is string.strip. Now I'm saying this is review because this is one of those, extra string operations that I mentioned last week that you should take a look at the Python docs and sort of read about. That said, I will go ahead and talk about it now just in case you didn't have time to do that. So string.strip, this returns a copy of the string with the leading and trailing white space removed. So white space is anything like a new line character or a space character, tab character, anything like that. And again, if you call .strip, it will get rid of that white space. So here's an example here. We have a line, which is a string. String is hello with a new line character. And if we print that line because of that extra new line character, and the fact that print also prints a new line, you can sort of see this sort of extra white space that happens, that extra new line that happens. Now, this is pretty similar to what we saw when we were reading the data from files, right? We saw that extra new line when we printed stuff. Now, if I go ahead and say, hey, line.strip, and then store the result of that strip back into line, and now I print it again, that essentially gets rid of that extra new line character. So again, .strip returns a copy of the string, so that means you need to store it back into a variable, and it gets rid of any leading and trailing white space, so any white space at the beginning or any white space at the end. Now this is super useful for this file stuff because, like I said, all those lines in the files, they will all have the new line character at the end except for the last line of code. But the cool thing about this, or sorry, not the last line of code, the last line of data, the cool thing about this is if that new line character is at the end, it will get rid of it. If it's not at the end, in the case that it's the last line of the file, it doesn't really do anything, but it doesn't make your code not work. So this will work for all the lines in the files. It work for all the lines that have the new line, and if it doesn't have a new line, it doesn't matter. It just will sort of skip that line. So again, .strip gets rid of any leading and trailing white space. So again, very useful when you're processing data from files, since each line in a file ends with a new line character. So here is an example that we were talking about earlier. So this was that courses.txt reading example where we read one line at a time using readLine. And this was the example that had those sort of extra new lines. Now you'll see here, this first line, line 1 equals infile.readline, and then we print line 1. So because the courses.txt file already has new line characters at the end of each line, when we first print it, this will have an extra white space. One new line character from the string itself as it's read from the file, and one new line character from the print statement. Then we go ahead and strip it, which will get rid of that extra new line character. So this will show extra new line character and then no more extra new line character. So again, dot strip, this is how you want to deal with handling those extra new line characters. So generally when you are working with lines in files, you read the line or use a for loop to read the line automatically, and then you immediately strip the line to get rid of any extra white space characters at the starting or the end, such as that new line character. Alright, another string method I want to talk about is string.split. So this one is pretty cool. So this is something that you apply to a string, and what it does is it returns a list. So you start with a string and you get a list back. And the way this works is it sort of splits up the string, hence the name split. It splits up the string into smaller strings and then puts those smaller strings into a list. So here's an example here. The string we start out with is the string hello, exclamation point, hi, exclamation point, and bye. And then I say, hey, let's go ahead and have a new variable, myList. Now again, remember string.split, you start with a string and you get a list back. And I say, go ahead and split my string and split it among the exclamation marks. So the cool thing about split is you can give it any string in there in the middle and it'll split along that. Now, if I go ahead and print my list, it will now print the smaller strings, the substrings that were separated by those exclamation marks. And you'll see again that they're in a list. So all the stuff that we learned about lists last week is going to be really important this week too. You need to remember all that list stuff from last week to do this week's stuff, because when you read stuff from a file, likely you will first go through one line at a time using a for loop. Then you will use string.strip to get rid of those extra new line characters. Then, if you have multiple pieces of data on the same line, maybe separated by a comma, like it's a comma separated value file, for example, you will then split up the line by, let's say, a comma, and then store all the essential information into a list like this, and then you can access individually the pieces of the list. So again, string.split takes a string, splits it up, and gives you a list back of all the sort of split up strings. Interesting thing about string.split is the argument is actually optional. So the argument that you say, hey, split it up by this string, it's actually optional. If you don't give it an argument, it will split based on all the white space. So all the white space, meaning spaces, tabs, new line characters, any white space. For the most part, you probably will give it a specific argument though, like we did in this previous example here. The argument here is that exclamation point string. Alright, so again, this is going to be extremely useful when you are processing data from a comma-separated value file. So again, comma-separated value files, each line in those files is going to be a string that has data separated by commas. This is a typo on the slide. It should be separated by commas, not strings. Let me fix that right now. Live fix. You can see me at action at work. Separated by commas. Yay. Okay. Alright. So again, it's going to be very useful when you want to separate data from comma separated value files where each line is a string of data separated by commas. So let's say here's an example line. This is an example line that you might get from a comma separated value file. I'm not showing all the file opening, closing stuff because you don't need that to see this example. Here's an example line. It's a string, has Guido, comma 1. And I say, hey Python, go ahead and split up that string by the commas. And we'll store that into this list that I'm going to call data list. Now the cool thing about this is then you can use those list indexing operators that we talked about last week to say, hey, now let's go ahead and isolate the the two important pieces of data here. So on this example line, you can see, okay, there's a name and then there's a number. So the name is going to be the thing at position 0 in the list that we made, right? Because the list is everything separated by a comma. First thing is Guido, second thing is that number 1. So the name is at position 0 in the list, and the ID number, that number, is the thing at position 1 in the list. You'll note here that I also went ahead and converted that ID number to an integer, right? Because everything that we're going to be reading from files, it's all going to be string. So this is a good time when you're already splitting up sort of the individual pieces of data from the list to, if you need to, convert them to different types, such as integers or floating point values. So again, all data read from and written to files is of type string. With numbers, you have to convert them to strings before you write them to files. And, as seen in this previous example, when you read them from a file, they're going to be a string, so you have to convert them to a numerical type like int or float before you do number stuff with them. So please do keep those types in mind whenever you are working with this file stuff.